Okay, so everyone should have a little note on their screen saying they're being recorded, and they just need to click that through. I'm just letting a few other people in. Marvelous. Okay, so hello and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are, and an extremely warm welcome to the beginning of our keynote sessions for the 35th BAPT conference. And we are really proud to confirm sponsorship of this session by the Myers-Briggs Company. We greatly appreciate the support that we get from the Myers-Briggs Company, and you can access further information about the Myers-Briggs Company by clicking on the link to their website beside this session's information on the conference website. And it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming Dr. Roy Childs, who is going to be speaking to us about Let's Talk About It, Beware False Prophets, 10 Myths Used to Berate Type. So Roy Childs is the founder member, one of founder members of the Myers-Briggs user group, which was the precursor to BAPT, the British Association for Psychological Type. And Roy Charles is a superb facilitator, coach, trainer, researcher, and author. And he's worked with the giants of personality, psychometrics, Cattell Schultz, and has developed psychometrics for the 21st century, most notably his type mapping tool. And Roy runs an organization called Team Focus and is just the most fascinating gentleman. We are completely thrilled that you're here, Roy. So thank you very much indeed. And I would like to just hand over to you now for your session on Let's Talk About It, Beware False Prophets, 10 Myths Used to Berate Type. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always hard to follow introductions like that. But thank you anyway. So, yes, welcome everybody. As you probably know, the talk is prompted by the vitriol against the MBTI in particular, but type in general. And the title False Prophets, I've looked at that a few times and thought it might sound a bit confrontational. So I want to make it clear that's not what I intend. Instead, really, I wanted to explore the question of what is personality, because I think that since the emergence of the big five, that's a question that seems to have ended, certainly in the psychometric world. And so using the word prophets is suggesting that many criticisms are presented as though they're incontrovertible truths. And prophets are not known for being open to discussion. So I want to take all of that, and this is all against a backdrop, which is that basically we are in a world of polarized debates. We've got the Brexit, remain and leave things, but you take any of them, you take, the pro-life, pro-choice, or the Trump versus Biden. I mean, things are so polarized, and a lot of it is a failure of listening. And unfortunately, I think that basically the type and the trait debate has fallen into that. I mean, people take positions, people then get labeled, labels oversimplify, and we need to find a more civilized way of exploring the possible approaches, different approaches to understanding personality, which means all of us to be more open-minded and trying to understand both sides. And when I'm talking about sides, again, that sounds a little bit polarizing, but I am putting on one side the type, but the Jung and the MBTI, and on the other side, it's trait and the big five. okay, and the psychometric model. So you'll hear me use all of those terms, suggesting that whenever I'm using one of those terms, I'm giving an idea of what I'm trying to focus on. And in this process, I hope that we can explore or examine or at least surface some of our own biases so that we avoid becoming prophets on whichever side we're on. So let's begin with what we can learn from people like Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, who became known as the Chuckle Brothers. And I'd suggest that they learned to disagree well. Now, that's an excellent example of what Jung would say is the tension of opposites and possibly transcendence. And if you want to know more of that, I actually got it from Steve Myers's books, a book here, which is well worth a read. But the 10 criticisms, which I think you will all have had the summary of. So I've put them here, the 10 points. I mean, it's actually quite interesting in trying to structure this talk and to think how we do this, because the criticisms roam across some are trivial, some are massive, and structuring them is difficult. And when I go into each one of these, sometimes there are so many angles to it. So I will basically be following this through. Sorry, what's gone on there? I will follow this through in this order. So as I'm talking about things, you've actually got a map of where I'm going or what I'm addressing. And if it's a little confusing at times, make notes and ask questions either at the end or possibly at the panel discussion, which we're going to have after lunch. So I would say that the overarching criticism of the type Jung trait side is basically it's non-scientific, it's unscientific. And psychology in particular is desperate to establish itself as a legitimate science. So it's particularly sensitive to that. And I'm trying to unpack a bit of the good versus bad science in less than an hour, and that's quite a challenge. So I will be skipping over some points. There will be holes in what I say, which is why making notes and asking questions later might be useful. So let me begin with the first criticism on the list, which is about the background of the developers. I mean, we know that Isabel and Catherine were simply untrained housewives. And we know that Jung was basically a wacky psychologist who was disregarded by the mainstream. But on that basis, would we reject electromagnetism? Because Faraday was just a self-taught scientist, and genetics, Mendel was just a humble monk, not a biologist. And Wegener, who came up with the theory of continental drift, had no background in geology at all. And then you can think about Einstein dreaming up E equals mc squared on the bus to the patents office. And we've got the best example of someone with no background at all, Leonardo da Vinci, a jack of all trades. So when people are saying basically type theory is meaningless because of the background, we need to just push that back and say, well, who else would you discount? You know, so much actually comes out of people who are from the left field somehow. So that's the first one. But the second one then, the one about type not being comprehensive, I mean, that usually hinges on the fact that it doesn't cover anxiety. And this just overlooks Jung's intent, which was to explore features of personality that exist when people are in a non-problematic state. He suggested that emotions sometimes cloud our understanding of personality. Hence, not being comprehensive is akin to saying that pigs don't fly. They're not meant to. Jung did not intend to cover personality comprehensively. So basically, I think that we can say that those two are fairly trivial. But I want to now go on to the more substantial criticisms about being non-scientific. Now, clearly, type theory comes from Jung's observations, which are necessarily limited to, a number of clinical cases and life experience. So it can be portrayed and is portrayed as an armchair or couch speculation process. But just as with the first criticism, we shouldn't discount it just because it's an insight from human observation, because that's often how science progresses, with intuition, springing from maybe a small range of observations, sometimes just one observation. So what Jung did is he believed he'd identified some fundamental individual differences, not trying to map the whole lot, but also how those individual differences interacted in a dynamic way. So, if you like, that's the emergence of type. Let me summarize, and this will take a bit longer, how the big five emerged. So it's got diverse origins, but the pivotal contribution to this was Ray Cattell, who was disillusioned about the subjectivity in personality research. So he would not have been happy with what Jung was doing either. But he turned to factor analysis as a more objective approach. But his purpose was to map the whole area. And more than most of the people who have followed, he understood the pitfalls of statistical manipulation. Basically, what you get out depends on what you put in. So as a personality researcher or author, I think anxiety is central, so I write lots of anxiety items. I oversample anxiety, and hey presto, an anxiety factor emerges. Cattell was clear that factor analysis alone would not guarantee objectivity. So what did he do? He wanted a more objective definition of personality, and he started with all the personality-related words in the dictionary, of which 17,389 were identified, which were then reduced to 172 clusters through expert analysis, some subjectivity. But from that, he obtained observer ratings, and that's when he chucked it into the factor analytic funnel and reduced it to his 16 fundamental elements and across multiple data sets. But he knew, and factor analysis automatically allows you to do this, it can be reduced further, and he reduced it to basically his 5 higher order factors. So maybe just his work led to the first big 5. Okay, more on that later. Now, there's no way of actually saying there is a right number of factors. It does depend on the level of detail. So think microscope, think telescope. And some even suggest that personality can be reduced to the big 2, or even the big 1. And the big one is a bit like what's happened when we look at intelligence testing, where the whole psychometric model came from. The big one in cognitive thinking is IQ. That is a reduction of all that complex stuff to one metric. But this progressive narrowing down to smaller and smaller numbers is actually the process behind the emergence of the big 5. Now, Cattell initially studied chemistry, and he was aware that there are countless compounds in the world which were then reduced to a handful of elements. And he wondered whether factor analysis could reveal the periodic table of personality. So are the big 5, or Neo's 30 facets, or Cattell's 16 factors, are these the equivalent to the underlying elements? I think that's unlikely. But the big 5, interestingly, are very similar to Jung's and MBTI's big four. So two very different backgrounds, in some sense, are converging. Now, that could be encouraging, but there is a devil in the detail. Let me tell you more about that. So one aspect is to examine the way in which each of these theories approach the question of measuring personality. And I have scoured the internet, the BPS, the APA, for some kind of consensual definition of personality. And there does seem to be a way of talking about these, and I think this summarizes it. Personality refers to our unique thought of feelings, behaviors, thoughts, and they're relatively stable. They characterize us, distinguish us from others, and influence behavior and performance. Now, that is behind the drive, I think, in the trait and the big five models. So if we now want to look at how that influences measurement, I've just taken some items from the NEO, suggested as the best marker of the big five. And if you look at those, they're quite interesting. Because if you look at number one, I like being part of a crowd at sporting events. I like being, I don't go very often, but I like it. It's a preference question. But I laugh easily is a behavioral question. And I believe that most people would take advantage of you if you let them is an attitude question. And I praise others, motivational preference. And I get angry is more about emotions. So this is a range that does seem to fit with the definition when you talk about all the thoughts and feelings and behaviors that people engage with. And you get the same eclectic range of items in other mainstream questionnaires. Here again, I've just taken another one. This is the Hogan's HPI, who also has a big five, but he decomposed it into what he calls the big seven. And the definition clearly influences the range of items. But nowhere do I find a rationale for why and how each of these different types should be sampled. In all the questionnaires, should there not be some guide for saying, well, how much of it should be behavior, how much thought, or in this scale? It doesn't appear to be that. What it appears to be, the justification for the items is purely statistical. They give good psychometric properties. And I'll come on to what good psychometric properties are and what they do. But to me, this eclecticism without a rationale is a weakness in the Big Five's claim to be particularly scientific. It's the weakness. And then that same eclectic range, today what happens is that we're getting an increasing divergence away from Cattell's attempt to get at the periodic table, because you find that almost anything that you put in this field into the factor analytic funnel produces something like the big five. And so I suggest that what we've got with the big five is a broad categorization, a bit like we have animal, vegetable, and mineral. Everything can be put into one of those buckets. Now, I was fortunate to run seminars with Ray Cattell between 1990 and 1992, and he was disappointed with the rigor of personality research. And he said to me, he said, Roy, the big five is like a fire blanket over the spirit of inquiry. The big five is only what survives a lack of theoretical rigor and clumsy factor analysis. That sounded pretty damning. And then on examination, we find that one person's big five is not the same as another's. So the big five are presented as a model, but look at this. Oh, that wasn't supposed to come up there. But if we look at Neo, look at that friendliness, sociability, assertiveness. Look at the 16PF. I mean, one very noticeable thing is the assertiveness is in one, but not the other. And it's not in MBTI step 2. In fact, all three of these, supposedly in the same area, define it or deconstruct it or compose it differently. And I find it really curious that Neo, supposedly the best marker, is driven that all 5 factors have got exactly 6 facets. Is that empirical? It's more maybe that Costa and McRae needed something neat and symmetrical. And as I say, MBTI step 2, well, that's another can of worms. So let's not go there at the moment. But you can look at other questionnaires, and this is an example of the most one of the most commercially successful, the OPQ. These are all ones in the people, relationship, and extroversion area, and they are different again. But if you factor analyze all those 30 and now 32 scales, guess what? 5 factors emerge, but they're different. You know, their nuances are different. And also, how do you get to these things? Persuasive, controlling, outspoken. I call this the loose competency approach because it was developed initially by asking managers what they thought was important at work. But look around at the world now, look in your cupboard. If you see baking powder and water, you see baking powder and water. You don't see sodium bicarbonate and H2O. So asking people at work what's important, they don't see the fundamental elements of personality. And basically, we have now got the trend towards competency-based approaches that lead to profiles like this and like this. Look at what you've got here, service orientation. That's complex. That's multifactorial. It's different in different contexts. So profiles today look more and more like off-the-shelf shopping lists. They've got attractive labels, and then that has an impact on how this field is developing, because if you look at how they're measured, this is some of the items that lead to a score on someone's decisiveness. These aren't probing the fundamentals of personality. They're like a survey of what people believe or wishes to project about themselves. I mean, I characterized a lot of this in a talk I gave, which was, is psychometrics going from Shakespeare to Gogglebox? I'm not sure that the rigorous scientific method is getting progressively better, which is what science should be doing. So, what are we measuring? I'm reminding you about criticism 3, and let me recap here that the mainstream in personality measurement is straying away from the roots because it seems to have abandoned the search for the periodic table and gone back to describing the world as we see it. Okay, and some people prefer another analogy. I mean, if you want to bake a cake, it's useful to know the ingredients. If you want to know a person, get the fundamentals of, you know, what makes them them. But instead, what we're getting is the end products. Persuasiveness is like a fruitcake or whatever. So to me, this does not mean that the big 5 is not useful, but I think it is simply the beginning of providing a map towards a much more interesting set of questions. And the fact that the big 5 is supposed to be scientifically rigorous, well, that leads me to thinking about it. I mean, it does tick many scientific boxes, I think more than type theory. But the purpose of the big 5 was to find a map of the whole personality domain, and the result is a map leading to significant questions at the levels of detail. So factor analysis has been substituted for what I think is more important, which is psychological theory. And it's also made measurement using eclectic items seem acceptable. So basically, I think we need to contrast what's happening with the science behind the big five and looking at type theory, on the other hand, which was never meant to map the whole domain. The theory now describes how those key underlying elements function, interact, and influence personality. Both theories have different purposes. One appears more empirical, the other more theoretical. But a feature of being more scientific is that it raises useful questions and challenges and hypotheses. That's a better yardstick than the simplistic accusation that type theory is less scientific than trait. So on that note, that's criticism 3, I'd like to revisit the concept of personality. The eclectic range of items includes ones about behavior, such as this one from the Neo. Now, given the desire to be recognized as a science and the behaviorism legacy, this is not surprising. And we may agree that ultimately what you say is not as important as what you do. But remember Milgram's experiments. People with white coats persuaded subjects to administer what they thought were lethal electric shocks. This demonstrates the impact of context and how behavior used for measurement can introduce noise. The mainstream approach tries to minimize the context issue by asking about, well, typically, on average. And I'm very critical of that as a solution. We know that averages hide so much. And who else argues for addressing the context issue? More famous people than me. Walter Mischel famously made the point in this book that context influences behavior more than personality. And more recently, Professor Jerome Kagan, in this book, calls his first chapter Missing Context. So this is getting at what I call the behavior issue, which has not been addressed properly in our thinking and measurement of personality. So let's revisit what is personality. And it always involves something inside us that we take across context. So I think of it as a tug of war. And this end represents the inside, including personality, and this end represents the outside, the context. The inside is what brings consistency or continuity as we traverse life. But what is the red ribbon? It represents behavior. Sometimes context dominates what we do. Sometimes who I am takes over. Hence, behavior is an unclear mixture of the two. And I suggest that a clearer picture of personality requires decoupling behavior from the inner me. This means recognizing what I do is not necessarily who I am, and using my nomenclature, it is that there's a difference between being and doing. Now, of course, behavior can provide a window into personality, but because it's a mixture of personality and context, it muddies the water, and we need a measure to measure them both separately to try and reduce the noise in our assessments. And to be honest, this has got so confusing because there are very popular questionnaires like the OPQ, which says it measures a work personality. Thinking of yourself at work. Now, should there be any difference in behavior at work, and should that be considered as a different personality or a role? And similarly, the best known role questionnaire, the Belbin, does not ask you about behavior in a specific context or team, but in some generalized concept that you take across different groups and teams. But people can play very different roles in their leadership team, the sports club team, the charity group that they volunteer with. So rather than being a role questionnaire, this captures some generalized behavior across groups, perhaps better defined as a team personality. This is so confusing and I think shows a lack of rigor at the conceptual level. The mainstream, from NEO to OPQ, has not tackled the behavior issue. Has MBTI done any better? Well, if you look at these items from the MBTI, again, it shows that same eclectic range of items as the mainstream. And the first one, I'm usually a good mixer, not only asks about behavior, but introduces the concept of good. And all personality questionnaires say there's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad. But where MBTI does score in reducing behavioral noise is with the overarching mindset of preference. Clearly, item 1 here shows how Isabel did not write all her items with a clear focus on preference, but she did introduce the word pairs, which does make indicating preference easier. And this was a very bold position to take for this untrained housewife. She was challenging psychological orthodoxy. And I suggest that this is one of the strengths of the MBTI, although it is sometimes put up as a weakness. But I don't think MBTI has gone far enough, because if you consider the challenge, would you rather have a week of love or excitement, diarrhea or constipation, be stuck in a lift with an ISTJ or an ENFP? These are not easy choices. Nearly everyone says, well, it depends. We should have not avoid the fact that everyone recognizes context. And then the MBTI solution, think of yourself at home with your slippers on, is home where your personality is the most engaged you, the most visible you, the place that you feel most alive. I mean, for some, it's up on the moors, it's in the woods, it's on the sea, it's at the football club. So just like OPQ, it is suggesting a context, this time home rather than work. And there are more issues with the concept of preference, because there are many ways. Think about how you would answer the preference question. It may be that you're influenced by your current role. People like to fit in, so their preference would be, and so often ESTJ organizations are not because of the personalities, but because people trying to be that culture of the organization. And then you've got, well, sometimes your preference is a comfort zone, which is sometimes a nice home, but actually it's sometimes because you're avoiding something else. Is it a going towards place or a moving away from place? And sometimes it's some outdated stereotype. It's what you've always said. Oh, I prefer. Okay. People often fail to update their sense of who they are or who they've become. And sometimes preference is some imaginary you, someone you would like to be. And sometimes it's not even your preference. It's your parents' preference or an idol. And sometimes it's a part of you that's never yet got out. Okay. So in the quest for simplicity, I believe that certainly many of the type indicators have trivialized the concept of preference. Oh, think of yourself at home with your slippers on. It really does depend. So the way I like to think about it is I introduce people to the four selves model, and I suggest that both the mainstream and the MBTI mindsets, because they oversimplify, should help people to think about which part of their being is being accessed. And if you think of this image as a symbol of the person with the outer you and the inner you, because we've all got a private inside, and think for yourself, how would you react if this person walked into the room with you now? Or this person might be a different reaction. Or this little girl. Okay? We can invite all of these. And what I call this is the contextual self. This comes back later in terms of how different parts of us engage in different contexts. But when we are trying to get at personality, we're trying to get behind the role, behind the context, at my sense of identity. Now, without explaining that to people before they do the questionnaire, you'll get an enormous merging, especially with behavioral items as well, of role mixing in. So it's a very cloudy picture. But as discussed earlier, this identity, this preference, even about that is hard to address. And the biggest dilemma with preference is separating the sense of who I am and who I want to be, what I call the ideal self. Okay. And I find it extraordinary that in this whole field of trying to understand the human condition, the ideal self is neglected and even put aside as not being relevant. The ideal self is such an important part of our psyche. And yet we introduced it in the type mapping system with the TDI by inviting people to answer preference the way it is, whether it's a comfort zone or whatever, but then preference the way I want. And I did steal this from Will Schutz and the FIRO because of how powerful it is in that model. And the evidence is so clear that 72% of people report two different types. 72%. Now, it may be that people in the type community have finally landed on their type, which is something that Jung would not be entirely happy with. But the idea that when you do this, I've done this with large numbers, and most people, the is want, they report a different type. That is hidden in the way in which the MBTI is approaching this in preference. But before I go on to that, I want to just finish the four selves because I have said four. So there is a fourth. And this is because the road to self-awareness is never complete. Most people actually rate themselves above average in self-awareness. If I had asked you all to rate on, a scale of, 1 to 10 or whatever, it's like most people with driving. Most people report above average on driving. Well, most people are above average on self-awareness because none of us are aware of what we're not aware of. So I flag the undiscovered self. There is always more to discover. And to make that point, what might you learn about yourself if you're in an earthquake or suddenly a refugee? All of us only know ourselves within the range of circumstances and experiences to date. So the undiscovered self opens the door to further exploration. And when people approach this self-awareness process or a questionnaire for that purpose, this lays out to them something which makes them curious and investigative rather than flicking it off and trying to get an answer. So the mindset issue, I think, is a significant one. Let me summarize. MBTI is criticized for introducing a woolly concept of preference, but the case can be made for claiming that this is a strength because it offers a way to get behind the behavioral role. Now, the mainstream can be criticized for introducing typical or average, forgetting or neglecting the fact that it can be very difficult for this kind of person. How would he respond? And by implication, all of us, since we all have two sides, hopefully not as dramatically as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it is an issue about finding the average in these situations. And then what we've got is this don't ponder too long instruction. This is a throwback to the selection roots of psychometrics, where people are playing a game. We aren't using type in that way. We're using it for self-exploration, personal development. Does that need to be hurried? Isn't it more useful to invite people to reflect? I encourage people to treat the questionnaire as an opportunity to update their thinking about themselves. Am I really like that? I've caught myself out like that and updating. So to me, it's a ludicrous instruction, which may be understood if you come from a selection mentality, but it beats me why MBTI fell into that mindset. I've got it here, the instructions about not pondering too long. So overall, both camps would benefit from this overriding issue of decoupling personality from behavior. And this is not one of the criticisms that is directly levied at MBTI, but the narrow one is, which is that preference is a weak indicator of personality. I would suggest the opposite. Given what MBTI is for, it's a strength, simply one that the MBTI has not taken far enough. Now, let's look at some of the psychometric evidence used to berate type. To illustrate, I want you to do a test. So I'm going to ask you to complete this preference test and make sure you have a piece of paper to record your answers. And looking at this first item, it's asking you to look around and point at something. Okay. Now, I want you to record which hand you pointed with. Left, right, neither, both. Okay. And do that for each of these. So if you've all got a piece of paper there, you should all have an L, N, or R down now. What about this one? Which hand did you use? Now remember, you're on video. You can do it discreetly. Okay. And when eating, which hand do you hold your fork? And imagine your royalty, if you can, and look to your right and wave. And now look to your left and wave. Which hands did you use? Which hand do you use to change gear in a manual car in the UK? Which hand do you use to change gear in a manual car in France? If people today know what a manual car is, by the way. Imagine using a screwdriver to fix a screw in the top left-hand corner of the room. Scratch your right cheek. Scratch your right elbow. Each time, which hand did you use? And which is your preferred hand? Okay. Now, calculate your total score. It's 1 point for an L, 2 points for an N, and 3 points for an R. Add them up and put your total in the chat. I'm sure there's better ways of doing this, but that's all I've got at the moment.
Sorry, Roy, could you repeat the scoring?
1 for L, 2 for N, and 3 for R.
Thank you.
I can see some are total scores and some aren't adding them up, but never mind. We've got 17, we've got 27, we've got 21, 22. So let me you will have had a score between 12 and 36. And I have run this test so many times. If we were in the same room, I'd get you out the front and I'd get you to stand in a line on that scale, and the distribution always looks something like this. This is used as evidence by the critics, even by well-qualified academics, that type theory of opposites is wrong. Characteristics differ by degree, as in trait theory. It's just a question of how far along the line are you. But do you use both your left and your right? Do you have a preference? The answer is yes. And the argument that basically saying this is proof that traits are accurate and that type is wrong is a basic misunderstanding. Some trait theorists actually say we would expect a bimodal distribution. Well, I have just shown you that if that was the case, I mean, this is actually going and saying you don't have a left and a right hand. You've got something in between. Whereas the theory of opposites is say you have both, you use both at different times, in different contexts, in different proportions, and it's the balance. And we go back to, this is what we find with MBTI scores and trait scores and TDI scores. We do get a continuity, but it does not mean that it invalidates the type theory. Lack of bimodality does not invalidate it. You can be sure that if anybody says that, they have not understood type theory. And of course, we all make mistakes. But if they claim to be experts, I suggest they're either being lazy or negligent. And a bit more related to that is the fact that type is criticized because it's a more static model of personality. So take this person scoring a 7 on an extroversion. What does it mean? That they spend less time extroverting than a 10? Or does it mean that they're extroverting with less intensity? I mean, I suggest that a 7 is actually pretty ambiguous, even if it is measured to 2 decimal places. I mean, how many people say things like, I heard Tim Spector say it on Desert Island Disc the other day, I'm pretty sociable, but I appreciate spending time on my own. Nearly everyone recognizes both ends of the scale. And perhaps a good questionnaire helps them to identify how much they balance each end. I suggest that people's experience of themselves is much less as a 7 and much more as, well, I'm a bit of this, but I'm probably a bit more of that. And this gets to the heart of our concept of personality. Perhaps the trait model does allow a little bit of movement along the scale from a 6 to an 8, maybe. Okay, but the type model is much more dynamic. Perhaps the mainstream is chasing a scientific rigor that has adopted the concept of continuity far too uncritically, based on how the physical world measurements, such as height and weight, may approximate to the bell curve. So let's make everything a bell curve. I mean, the fact that height and weight are like that does not mean that psychological attributes should be. So the accusation that type takes a more static view of personality, I think, is not justified. And once again, I would suggest that probably the opposite is true. So, I mean, we have to take a bit of flack here. I think that the MBTI community has contributed to that accusation. I mean, look at this. These 16 boxes without good explanation is likely to lead to a reaction like this. How many people have said that to me? Loads. And add into that the traditional one-sided presentation of scores, this contributes to the misunderstanding of the dynamic tension of opposites. It may have been more helpful and more accurate and less prone to misinterpretation to at least present them like this. This reminds people of both sides, but also indicates the degree of balance or imbalance. So the community then magnifies this one-sidedness with the, and this may touch a few of you here, I am a WXYZ type. And again, it is magnified yet again. And it might not be quite clear now, but we're going to get you to best fit type, bang. I mean, this suggests that, you know, best fit type is a terminus rather than a station on the journey. Now, I'm sure a lot of you get around that by helping people and understanding that differently. But I am a WXYZ does suggest, got it, I've arrived. Whereas I prefer, more accurately, currently I'm reporting as a WXYZ. This suggests the possibility of change, at least change in the dynamic balance, if not as well, the possibility of development and even transcendence. And I've found that using the TDI is want version I mentioned earlier automatically reveals a person's internal dialogue. It begins an exploration of the complexity of preference, and it suggests a possible direction of travel. So I know this might make some MBTI traditionalists uncomfortable, but I invite you to consider how I am a WXYZ type communicates the wrong message. All this contributes to the inaccurate accusation that type is fixed, labeled, puts you in a box, and is want automatically says there is some movement here. And the idea that type labels puts you in a box like that does suggest rigidity. So please write your challenges to me for later. Now, on to what are the big ones, if you like, the ones that are most heavyweight, that MBTI is unreliable. And we know that reliability and validity are the clarion calls of psychometrics. And I've got no issue with that. The issue I have is, what do they mean? The accusation that MBTI is unreliable is generally because the evidence shows that more than 50% of people report a different type even after just a few weeks. It's in the MBTI manual. And that accusation makes people distrust the results. Why? Because being unreliable means it's inaccurate, doesn't it? That's the suggestion. The problem is that how would we know that an abstract concept like personality is accurate or not? And psychometric measurement tussled with this and tried to solve it for intelligence and ended up with the tautology. Intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. The reality is we don't know if we're being accurate. So psychometrics has chosen a proxy for accuracy based on the physical world. We can be confident that measuring height, okay, is something that hasn't changed, at least within a particular time scale. That's always needs to be there. But in that case, then consistency can be a measure of accuracy, but not necessarily. You can be consistently wrong. And the basic psychometric model assumes that what we're measuring has or does not change. Now, this has been controversial when applied to intelligence. I suggest it's even more controversial when we apply it to personality, certainly the way I think about personality. So the mainstream adopted the psychometric model, which assumes that attributes don't change, It therefore views personality through a static lens. Any change is then cast as unreliability. This then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because the measurement then weeds out any items that are sensitive to change. So the mainstream encourages the no change assumption and compounds it with the don't ponder too long. Just say what you always say. It discourages reflection, getting people to say what they always say. So type, on the other hand, with Jung's more dynamic view of personality, I challenge whether the model of reliability is the appropriate one for what we're doing. And again, it's so simplistic. It's coming through a narrow lens when it is said, oh, well, people change. What actually changes? And before I go into that a bit more, I'd like to add a further dilemma, which is that the consistency lens comes from our understanding of physical attributes, and we need to make a distinction between what I call hard numbers, where we can be confident that 5 is more than a 4. But how do we know it? That when I rate myself as 4 on sociable, that I'm less sociable than when you rate yourself on 5. We all have different benchmarks. I call these soft numbers, where a 4 may actually be higher than a 5. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that we are only using self-report and then using heavyweight statistics as if they're hard numbers.
Just to step in, Roy, a couple of
Mhm.
minutes before 1:30.
Right, okay, so MBTI is unreliable. I'll move on from that. I didn't know the time was going. And now the validation clincher, you know, the whole horoscope stuff, etc. Why? Because the questionnaires, I mean, the mainstream questionnaires do predict behavior to a very low level. Predictive validity is in the 0.2 to 0.4 range. But if you ask anyone on a scale of 1 to 10, how persuasive are you? I tell you that you would get correlations with how persuasive they are in real life of about 0.2 to 0.4 as well. Because what I think about myself has some reality. These predictive validities are only sort of at the lower level of the obvious. So the other issue with the model of validity that we have is that we then take these generalized concepts that only work in large numbers and try and apply it to some individual, which is not appropriate. Okay, so large group results are not appropriate at the individual level. Just as in Boyle's law, you know, you don't predict where molecules go. You can only do what the large number of a gas does. And you can explore that a bit more because the problem of averages is huge, as you got in this book. So finally, then, let's go on. There are, summarizing this, and I'm speeding up a bit now, there are all these things that I've covered here. MBTI results have no validity. We need to be thinking much more about what validity is. Okay, and the horoscope one is, I've taken that as an extra one because the reports are too nice. Well, of course they're nice because they're not about you. They're about your potential. They're about what your type, when it is well developed and in harmony, could look like. And they don't avoid negativity. You just look at your opposite type to see what is likely to be more difficult or irritating. Okay, so I reconceptualize personality as like an MRI scan, different stimuli, different parts of me light up. You know, I'm a mosaic, I'm an unfinished painting, and the role of experience in all of this is that experience has a tremendous impact on what eventually emerges through life, but it is change throughout life. So I'd like us to think of type and trait like wave theory and quantum theory. We can live with both, and we need to go from the metaphor, which is that with our questionnaires, we get some kind of still picture, but we want to recreate movement, the reality, the dynamism of what personality is. Thank you. That wasn't supposed to go again.
Thank you, Roy, very much indeed. That is absolutely fabulous. Thank
I love-
you. Really, really appreciate that. I'm going to stop the recording.